Alright, so it's been a while, but it is Challenger time. This is the last episode of Up on the Union Pacific. I'm at Candelar, which is a station you've probably never heard of. There's two reds behind me because it's a Sunday and it's shut for maintenance. Just been talking to the local engineers for this line. There'll be a drone flying back and forth, but that just adds to the local colour. Anyway, if we hark back to that photograph that I dug up a few years back, from the photographer's point of view, we have the TTT to start with, that solid freight moving workhorse. 210 wheel arrangement, 2-cylindered, high tractive effort, a lot of force expended through the piston thrusts, relatively limited driver height, and therefore limited room to counterbalance all of that piston thrust. The confluence of centre of balance and centre of yaw, which meant that locomotives with those symmetrical centre powered wheel arrangements tended to be less than ideal when it came to tracking and riding. The 210-2 did have the advantage of that very long, rigid driving wheel base, tempered only by a little bit of lateral motion here and there. We go back one more locomotive and we have that first attempt to alleviate some of the difficulties with all that piston thrust, and we divide the tractive effort up amongst 3 cylinders, therefore lessening the thrust on each. Those locomotives were capable of hauling more faster than the TTTs, but they tended to be used to haul more still at relatively the same road speed as the TTTs. Only a handful were built by the Union Pacific, clearly not the answer they were seeking. We go one locomotive back and we have the big 9s, 4, 12, 2. Like the FTT in front of it, 4 wheels up front, partly to carry the 3 cylinders, heavier than 2, and partly to alleviate difficulties with tracking. They achieved their design purpose, but when you look at the curves for road speed and the curves for maintenance, they coincide at acceptable levels of relationship up to around about 50 miles per hour. When you push beyond that, the Union Pacific found that the cost of maintenance outweighed the benefits of that higher road speed. Now, the big 9s were built in significant numbers, and they are the evolutionary endpoint for 3-cylinder freight power in North America. Behind that comes the Challenger. Challenger means a number of things, depending on the context. It most certainly means the 4-6-6-4 wheel arrangement, consistent with Alco's policy. If a road pioneered a wheel arrangement, they got to name the wheel arrangement. Where the name came from, there's a couple of explanations. One is that it was named for an existing named train on the Union Pacific. The other is that when the expectations for the locomotive were set out on paper at the early design stages, one of the individuals involved expressed the opinion that that would be a challenge for any locomotive. So we have Challenger 4664. We also have the Challenger class, and I'm reasonably certain that CSA 1 and 2 stands for Challenger Simple Articulated. So what we have is 4 iterations on the Union Pacific, broadly similar, but increases of power as they unfold. CSA 1 and 2, 4664, 3 and 4. They also benefited from the experience of the big boys that came during the combined production run of the Challengers. Whilst the big 9s represented the evolutionary endpoint for 3-cylinder simple power in North America, the Challengers represented one of 3 endpoints for 6+6 articulated locomotives on that continent. Because parallel to them, we have the 2-6-6-4 experience on, say, the Norfolk and Western or the Seaboard Airline, for instance, and the 2-6-6-6 experience with the Alleghenies. The important thing about those other 2 evolutionary endpoints when comparing them with the Challenger is their firebox. In both instances, the firebox sat behind the rear drivers. And the material difference between the Allegheny and the Norfolk and Western A-Class, for instance, is the sheer dimension of the firebox, hence the 3-axle trailing truck. It is that firebox that generates the heat to power the massive boiler to produce the massive amounts of power. That power is expressed through 6+6, so therefore the factor of adhesion on that locomotive is significantly high. 2 up front, followed by 6 and 6 driving wheels, was the maximum that could be fitted under the boiler and smoke box that's in proportion to the heat generated from the furnace. On the Union Pacific, however, with the Challenger, we see the firebox sitting over the rear drivers and extending over the trailing truck. That's similar to the big 9s, but it is bigger again. Now, on the big 9s, the trailing axle carried more load than any other axle on the locomotive. And with the firebox being bigger on the Challenger, it necessitated 2 trailing axles in order to keep under the maximum axle loading. With the firebox extending over the rear drivers, it means that the boiler proper, from the driver and fireman's point of view, starts in a more forward direction, which means it extends beyond the leading engine more so than on a 2664. Therefore, the front end weight needs to be carried by a 2-axle leading truck. The 2-axle leading truck also assists with tracking. We tend to think of these powerful locomotives as doing their work hauling upgrades. With those transcontinental distances, there's also the need to run fast along a straight or a downhill run in order to get the overall time as low as possible. The other factor that allowed the Challengers to run fast was that the nature of the hinge changed in the articulation joint. Traditionally, the hinge would allow the front engine to go up and down as well as sideways for curvature. In the later Challengers, those hinges were really only allowing lateral movement. And if we think back to the classic North American standard 440 locomotive and its tripod suspension system, we have drivers on one side, drivers on the other being the back 2 legs, and the 4-wheel truck up front being the front leg to provide the tripod. On the later Challengers, the suspension was effectively that the rear engine drivers on one side were equalized with the trailing wheels on that side. Same on the opposite side to give 2 legs. For the rigid frame, the front leg was the front engine, which was itself a tripod. In a more classical sense, drivers on one side, drivers on the other, leading truck up front. So it's a tripod sitting on a tripod. What that did was even up the adhesive weight between leading engine and trailing engine, because on the first iterations of the Challenger, the adhesive weight was unevenly divided between the 2 engines. This meant that the front engine tended to be slippy by comparison with the rear engine and required careful handling on startup. I want to hark back again to the size of the firebox on the Union Pacific, because this is something that tends to get pushed to the side when we're comparing locomotives from the east with the west, and that is the quality of coal that's being burnt. The Union Pacific philosophy, and shared by other western roads that had access to poor quality coal, was to have a massive firebox and to spit as much poor quality coal into it as the mechanical stokers could muster. It didn't matter that a fair amount of that coal was sent uncombusted up the chimney. The coal was dirt cheap. If you emptied the bunker going up one side of Sherman Hill, it didn't really matter because you could recoal at the top. On the eastern roads with the Allegheny, for instance, much better steaming quality coal, therefore a fundamentally different firebox. In some ways, when we look at the evolutionary endpoint for those 6+6 articulated locomotives that started with Old Maud, we have an endpoint for eastern roads with good quality coal and an endpoint for western roads with poor quality coal. There's also some visual differences that are worth noting with the Challengers as they unfolded through their 4 iterations. The tenders changed from a 6-wheeled bogie and 6-wheeled bogie tenders into those centipede types, similar to what the big boy had and other big end Malay power at that time. There's also smoke deflectors we see up front on the later iterations of the locomotive. I'm uncertain as to whether or not these were ever retroactively fitted to the earlier types. I'm also uncertain as to whether it's an affectation purely to allow for passenger work to be undertaken, or it was just seen as a general benefit regardless of the role played by the locomotive. It's worth noting that the Challengers on the Union Pacific were able to double as passenger locomotives. And if we think of that design standard that was mooted in the dying days of steam, hauling 1,000 tonnes at 100 miles per hour on the flat, the Challengers do quite well on that test. Certainly with hauling 1,000 tonnes would have been an easy exercise for a Challenger on the flat. Getting up to 100 certainly would have been beyond it, but we are talking about a locomotive that could haul very good tonnage at speeds in excess of 70 miles per hour if given the chance. There's an argument that says that the Challengers were the mainstay of the Union Pacific locomotive fleet during its last years of steam. Certainly the numbers would suggest that, and that the big boys were its helper. Again, the numbers would suggest that. I think probably the explanation is that the Challengers were useful throughout the empire on the Union Pacific, certainly with their flexibility allowed them significantly more route availability than the big nines, and probably also the big boys, but then the big boys never had the numbers to spread out through the empire. But that climb up from Ogden to the top of the hill on the Wasatch Mountains, clearly the need for the big boys indicated that on that particular role, the Challengers weren't quite up to the standards that the traffic required. Perhaps the biggest compliment that can be paid to the Challengers as a locomotive evolutionary step is that their success essentially created the confidence in going to the big boy stage. Now, before I close off the series, there is another photograph taken of those 4 locomotives hauling up Sherman Hill. It's taken from a different angle, so we see that the Challenger is one of the later types. We can also identify the road number of the big 9 that had suffered a failure, and I'll have a hunt around and see if I can find the date it was removed from service. And if I do, I'll post it below. Anyway, that's what we have. Thank you for watching. I don't know what I'm going to be doing next, but I'll think of something. And also, just want to say, thank you for Lawrence for buying me a coffee. Cheers.